Why don't we get started? It looks, so it's a beautiful Monday, daylight savings here in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT in the Office of Digital Learning. And we're one day away from Election Day for the US, which is important. And I think Rajesh and Katie reminded us that it's also another important day, which they can tell you about. So just to kick things off, actually, I think everybody here we've seen before at prior webinars. So this is part of a partnership between ClimateX, led by Rajesh and Dave Damloor, and the Office of Digital Learning, where I'm the Director of Digital Learning Experience. And this is part of MIT's effort to create deeper levels of engagement between global learners like you and the outside world and the MIT community. And we're really happy to have Katie Mulvaney with us today, and I'll let her introduce herself. But without any further delay, why don't you get us started, Rajesh?
Thank you, Mark. So we are, this is ClimateX webinar number 6, and we're really happy to have Katie Mulvaney. She's a graduate student in the TPP program here at MIT, but I'm going to pass the baton on to her real quick. She is going to be our policy person, or rather the person who intervenes between the scientists and the policymakers. I like the description of TPP a lot, so you might have to explain to us what TPP does and what you're doing.
Thanks, Rajesh. It's great to be here. So I'm a second-year master's student in the Technology and Policy program here at MIT. So that's what the TPP stands for. And the way that I normally describe TPP is that it's a public policy degree for scientists and engineers. But we don't only focus on public policy and government policy, but we also have some people who focus on business policy. So, you know, policy across the spectrum. But we are people who sort of exist in this boundary between scientists and policymakers. And we just try to learn both languages and be able to communicate with people on both sides of the spectrum and just sort of facilitate communication across those lines.
Tell us the kind of, give us a brief tour of the kind of policy issues that you engage with and why you came to them in the first place.
Sure, yeah. So I guess I could tell you a little bit about what I was doing before I came to MIT to start with. So I worked for 3 years as an engineer at a technical consulting firm, and I was focused mostly on projects in the nuclear power industry. Actually, if you tuned into the webinar on nuclear power, one of my former colleagues, Patrick White, we both worked at the same company, so you guys have already heard from him. But like I said, I was focused on projects in the nuclear power industry. I was doing both mechanical engineering jobs and civil engineering jobs, focused on, very down in the technical details with thermal hydraulic analysis, structural analysis, a little bit of materials work. And this was sort of my dream to work in the nuclear industry as I was coming up with in my undergraduate career. It was a really cool technology, so that was great as an engineer. It was also a clean technology, and I've also been somebody that cares passionately about the environment, so it was important for me to work in an industry that didn't have really negative impact on the environment. So that brought me to the nuclear industry, but as I was coming up in my career right after I got my undergraduate degree, a couple of things were happening. The first was natural gas prices were dropping in the United States, and that was making construction of new nuclear projects a lot less attractive, and it was also leading some nuclear plants to shut down. There were several plants that shut down during my time as an engineer at this technical consulting firm, and a lot of the reasons cited had to do with economics and natural gas prices. The second thing that was going on was Fukushima happened when I was a junior in college, and so you saw this renewed fear of nuclear power from the public, and there were also a lot of cascading effects in the regulatory space from Fukushima. a lot of plants had to go back and look at their design bases and make sure that they could be prepared for a natural disaster like the tsunami that happened at Fukushima, and sort of like redoing some of their calculations. So it was an interesting time to be beginning my career, and I got really interested in these issues that not just the issues with technology of nuclear and how it was really cool that we can harness neutrons and nuclear energy to make power, but also that there's social issues associated with nuclear power. People are really afraid of it, and there's a reason for that. And also there's really interesting economic issues with nuclear. So I was interested in learning more about social and economic aspects of the industry, and that brought me here to MIT and the TVP program.
Well, we're really happy that you made that switch. And today is actually a great day to be talking about climate issues in general. Do you want to say a little bit about what today means?
Sure, yeah. So today, November 7th, is the first day of the Marrakech Climate Conference. And underneath the umbrella of this larger climate conference is COP22, which is the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the 22nd meeting of the COP. It's also CMA1, which is it's the Conference of the Parties underneath the Paris Agreement. And then the third is the 12th Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So those are all happening over the next 2 weeks at the Marrakech Climate Conference in Morocco. So this is a really great time to be talking about global action on climate change.
I guess since you are our policy person, why don't you give us a little bit of a maybe 30,000 foot overview of the international policy landscape through the UNFCCC or even maybe more generally?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So when you're thinking about international climate governance and you're talking about some of these big climate conferences, I think there's a couple of institutions that are good and almost like vocabulary words to understand, because it can be very confusing. And when I first started doing research here at MIT, I had to do a lot of kind of background work on what all these institutions were. So the first one I'll mention is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which I'm sure many of you have heard of before. It's the leading scientific assessment body for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it sort of got the ball rolling with international action on climate change. It was formed in 1988, so it existed even before the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it sort of helped to build concern for this issue of global warming and climate change. So just to tell you a few things about what IPCC does and does not do, they collect, review, and synthesize scientific information that has come out over the past 4 years. I believe they meet every 4 years or so. And they sort of translate it into into meaningful information for policymakers. What they don't do is they don't perform research themselves as a scientific assessment body, and they do not prescribe policy. They just provide information to policymakers. So that's the IPCC. Sort of moving down the history of global climate action, I guess the next important thing to know is what exactly is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. So this body was formed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, and strictly speaking, it's a treaty, and it has 196 member countries, and those countries include anywhere from highly developed nations like the United States and the United Kingdom and other European Union nations, as well as rapidly developing countries, which includes China and India. Countries that are still developing, like maybe Uganda, and then also small island developing states. So this is really, so the UNFCCC has representation across the whole range of economies in the world. And so the main goal of the UNFCCC is to create some legal instruments to help the world adapt and mitigate effects of climate change. And so we've seen a couple of legal instruments come out under the UNFCCC, and that's the Kyoto Protocol and now the Paris Agreement. And it'll be interesting to see where the new Paris Agreement takes us.
Right. So you mentioned how IPCC doesn't do research and doesn't enact policy. So tell us a little bit about why. Is that a principal choice or just a practical decision? Why is it divorced from both of those potential activities?
Mm-hmm. So I think that the reason that the IPCC is divorced from actually doing the research and actually making the policy is to sort of create a sense or an institution that is sort of third party, I guess. We always hope that scientists and engineers remain objective from an issue and just provide only the facts. At least what we learn in the technology and policy program is that it's very difficult to do, but you want to set up an institution so that you can have the most objective evidence possible. And so I think that's why the IPCC is set up that way. I think if it did the scientific research itself, then it's not that the whole entire world of scientists is on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's representatives from different domains and also different governments all over the world. So by doing research themselves, I think they're leaving out a large body of scientists that have really important work to contribute to the global climate action stage. And the reason that they don't prescribe policy, I think, is very simply that they're just not policymakers. They're scientists, and that's maybe not how they're trained and not what their professional career has been in. So they sort of leave the policy to the policymakers and the negotiators of the UNFCCC.
So what's the flow? So, I'm at the IPCC, I have synthesized, say, 10 years worth of climate data, and I feel like this is what it looks like. Here are the trends, and therefore here's maybe, if not the actual policy, at least suggestions for directions in which we should be going. How do we take that information, and is there a formal process through which the IPCC works with member countries of the UNFCCC or others to enact policies, or is this entirely just a recommendation, or is there an actual policy regime that flows out of the IPCC?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the main way that they communicate with the member countries is through the reports that come out of their meetings that happen every 4 years. And they only provide suggestions, right? So I don't think that there's no legal mechanism like with teeth that says the UNFCCC must use the recommendations of the IPCC. We might actually see something like that in the future. So one of the things that the member countries are going to talk about at Marrakech is the process by which the member countries will assess the nationally determined contributions, which I can explain. I can go into a little bit more detail later about what's sort of the framework of the Paris Agreement. But one of the questions is, okay, how are we going to assess these nationally determined contributions that countries come up with in a way that's fair? What input information do we use? So with that issue, you might see the member countries decide, okay, we only want to use information that's vetted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But as of right now, like I said, I don't think there's anything with teeth that requires member countries to use the IPCC, but it's just sort of a really good resource of a lot of the research that's being done on climate change. And they put out a special report that is sort of written more in the language of policymakers. I guess the other thing I'll say is that the 2 degrees C goal for temperature rise that the member countries have sort of settled on under the UNFCCC. That came out of research from the IPCC. So it might not be required that member countries use it, but the IPCC is certainly extremely influential.
Thanks, Katie. So moving on from the IPCC to the next set of initials, which is the UNFCCC. So 3 C's instead of 2. Tell us a little bit about what that framework convention looks like and what role it's playing and continuing to play.
Sure, yeah. So the UNFCCC, it's truly an alphabet soup of acronyms on the international climate governance stage. So like I said, the UNFCCC is strictly speaking a treaty, but it's an umbrella treaty. So there's nothing that is necessarily legally required. You're not going to see any countries taking legal action on global climate change under the UNFCCC. That's going to come under some legal instruments that are negotiated underneath of the UNFCCC. So if you think about it, or you can remember it, UNFCCC umbrella. So it's an umbrella treaty. And I actually have a quote here from the text of the UNFCCC, and it says that the ultimate objective of this convention and any related legal instruments that the Conference of the Parties may adopt is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that's really the overarching goal of the UNFCCC. And just with that excerpt alone from the text, there's a ton that the Conference of the Parties needs to negotiate on. So for example, what exactly does stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations mean? And also, what is a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system? So it sort of lays the framework for what exactly the Conference of the Parties are negotiating over and will create legal instruments on.
So will the meaning of these terms come from the IPCC? So for example, a term like stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at a level, right? I mean, all of these are terms that we can debate. So who settles the debate?
Mm-hmm. So ultimately, the Conference of the Parties is going to settle that debate, but they're going to use information that comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So like I was saying before, the 2 degrees Celsius goal, I think in the text of one of the IPCC reports, they vaguely mention 2 degrees Celsius as, they sort of talk about what might happen if you have 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And they use a lot of words like, a lot of words actually to describe probability, and of course kind of translated into policymaker language. That sort of says like maybe most damage may be avoided if global warming remains under 2 degrees Celsius. And like I said, it might be only mentioned a couple times in that IPCC report, but ultimately it's the Conference of the Parties, or it's the member countries that will decide what exactly those terms mean under the UNFCCC.
So in principle, it could be different numbers for different countries?
It could, yeah, you're right. I mean, that could definitely mean different numbers for different countries, but you do need unanimity under any kind of legal instrument. So countries need to negotiate and come to an agreement on what those numbers are.
Well, talking about negotiation, I guess there's one more acronym that comes here, Common but Differentiated Responsibility, CBDR, right? I guess that's the basis for negotiation, I'm assuming.
It is, yeah. So that's a main principle that guides any legal instruments that are negotiated under the UNFCCC. And if you haven't heard of it before, I can just tell you a little bit about what exactly is meant by common but differentiated responsibilities. So there's a few sides to CBDR. So first, it's that developed countries recognize how much they've contributed to climate change and environmental degradation so far. So we talk about climate change as a legacy problem, and that's mostly because carbon dioxide is well mixed in the atmosphere and it has a super long lifetime. So that means that emissions from the United States and the European Union countries that they emitted back in like the early 20th century, that might still be in the atmosphere. So CBDR is sort of the acknowledgement that past emissions from developed countries are still affecting the environment. The other side to CBDR is that developing countries recognize that they have a responsibility to develop sustainably. So it's sort of a recognition that developing countries can't necessarily do all the same things that developed countries did in order to grow their economies. And then the final side to that is, if that's the case for developing countries, then they need help in order to develop sustainably. So that's where you sort of get this responsibility of financing from developed countries. And that's in the form of actual funds, so actual money, and also in the form of technology transfer, so patents and things like that.
So all of this was brought to a head at COP21 in Paris, right? And that's when the deals were made. So tell us a little bit about what happened and therefore what's going to happen starting today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I guess the first thing I'll say about the Paris Agreement is that it was pretty monumental. I think there's some discussion and maybe even disagreement over how successful the Paris Agreement will be in the future. But I think one thing that experts sort of agree on is that the fact that all of the member countries of the UNFCCC agree to it is huge. You saw a lot of heads of state at the high level segments of the Paris conference last year. Like, for example, President Obama came, and you don't normally see that at these international environmental negotiations. You'll send like a head negotiator, like Gina McCarthy from the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Secretary of State. But you don't always see so many heads of state. So it was something that was on many governments of the world radar. So that was huge that we got agreement across all of these different governments. There's a few themes of the Paris Agreement. There's this theme of transparency. There's a theme of a global stocktake and ratcheting. And then there's also a huge focus on financing. So as far as transparency goes, the one really important legally binding part of the Paris Agreement are these nationally determined contributions. So if you were following the events leading up to the Paris Agreement last year, you saw countries submitting intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. Yeah, so this is basically the same thing. So they pretty much made it mandatory for countries to submit these NDCs into the future that talk about their plan, not only for climate change mitigation, but also for adaptation and for finance. So developed countries have to talk about how much they're going to contribute as far as finance goes for developing countries, and then developing countries need to say how much of that money they need in order to implement their climate action plan. The other big theme of the Paris Agreement is this ratcheting mechanism and the global stocktake. So this part of the Paris Agreement acknowledges that the NDCs that have been submitted so far from the countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement does not get us to that 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so every 5 years, the plan is to have this global stocktake that sort of tells us, okay, how close are we to meeting our goal? And how much more do we need to do? And it also, I think, and this is sort of just my own personal assessment, it's a way for countries to be accountable to one another. So it's a way to see who maybe can do a little bit more, and who who is like meeting their potential well. And then I think the final really important part of the Paris Agreement is the finance mechanism. So I think the estimate, as of the latest estimate, is that countries have agreed to, developed countries have agreed to provide about $62 billion per year by 2020, and the goal is $100 billion per year. So what's going to need to happen in the future is we're going to need to see a means to that developed countries get to that goal of $100 billion a year.